Good evening, and welcome to the Faculty Research Seminar at SAIS Europe. My name is Eric Jones, and I'm Professor of European Studies and International Political Economy. This is our second seminar meeting of the academic year and our first single-person event. We host sorts of conversations every Monday and Thursday. You can find the program on the website of the Bologna Institute for Public, or www.bipr.eu, together with the links for remote viewing. You're also welcome to share those widely. We're very proud of the speakers that we're able to attract and eager to share the insights they have to offer as widely as we can. The conversation we're going to have tonight is particularly relevant to the mission of SAIS as a school of public policy. It's also our role as an institution. Specifically, we're going to talk to Professor Alexander Stubb about a book idea he is developing and that I look forward to reading. The initial premise and the longer proposal he's drafted are both excellent. The question is beguilingly simple. We can all see that the pace of technological innovation is accelerating and that the use of technology is spread in ways that are transformative and disruptive. What's less obvious is whether some parts of the world are better endowed politically and institutionally to adapt, by which I mean both resisting the more disruptive aspects and changing in ways that take full advantage of the technological innovation. Even more attractively, Professor Stubb has decided to frame this question as a big geopolitical comparison of large continental organizations with unique organizational characteristics: the United States, Europe, and China. In doing so, he can shed light not just on whether one system of government is more resilient or adaptive than another, but also what all this means for the balance of power and world order. Most important, though, Professor Stubb has some preliminary ideas how we might influence these developments to shift the balance between disruption and transformation, while at the same time promoting important values related to individual rights, environmental conservation, and human dignity. Now, it's a broad canvas. Now, this is all very impressive for a guy who can't seem to hold on to a job. In his 13 years, he was a member of European Parliament, a foreign minister, a minister for European affairs and trade, a prime minister, and a finance minister. Now, in fairness, he did all these things for the same employer, which is the people and government of Finland. But he also had a lot of sidelines, like heading up the OSCE during the 2008 conflict between Russia and Georgia, and twice and triathlon competitions in Hawaii. In 2017, Professor Stubb tired of politics and so became vice president of the European Investment Bank. A few years later, he realized he really wanted to do is be an academic. Now, Professor Stubb is director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. This is a new challenge and a big one. Importantly, however, Professor Stubb is exceedingly well equipped in academic terms. Not only has he written and edited 18 books, including guides to the functioning of the European Union and readers on European Union politics, but he has also made fundamental contributions to our understanding of the European integration process. His 1996 article on differentiated integration, written 3 years before he finished his doctorate at the LSE, has been cited almost 500 times. I can think of no one better to bring together insights from the world of academia and practice to reflect on the fundamental challenges we face. I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Professor Alexander Stubb. Now look, what we're going to do is do this as a conversation between me and Professor Stubb, and we want to get you guys into the conversation, not just you who are in the room, but also those of you who are on Zoom. If you want to participate in the conversation on Zoom, I would strongly encourage you to place your questions into the Q&A box, which is, if you hover your mouse over the screen, you'll see a band at the bottom of your Zoom light up, and it's the one right next to the chat box. If you put them in the Q&A box, then they'll all be in the same place and we'll be able to manage them more effectively. But for right now, I've got some questions that I'm going to ask Professor Stubb to start a conversation. We'll talk until I run out of questions or steam, and then I'll turn to you for inspiration, and we'll try to extract as much insight as we can. It truly is an ambitious project, and one, I think, that warrants our close scrutiny and attention. And I guess my first question for you, Alexander, is is, why is technological change so much more challenging now than it was, I don't know, in the past? What is it about technological change today that you think makes it so warranting of attention in these broad political geostrategic terms?
Sure. Thanks, Eric, and thanks for that rather nice introduction. I'm listening to it. Sort of the notion of you can't keep a job. It is worrying. I mean, you can't sort of change every 2 years, but hanging in politics nowadays is a pretty tough job in and of itself. But one thing for sure, let's begin by dropping the titles. Typical informal Finn. So none of this professor stuff. I mean, actually, the only title that I really like is former prime minister. And the reason I like it is that, you've done the job, you don't have to take the shit anymore. You can sit here and talk about it quite openly. So I really appreciate the invitation. And to give a short answer on the impact of tech, I think you put it quite well yourself in saying that on one hand it's disruptive, and on the other hand it's transforming. The reason it's taking center stage, I think, in world politics at the moment is that we are seeing a shift in the power balance globally. We're seeing countries such as the United States and United Kingdom in many ways voluntarily marginalizing themselves from the nexus or the core of power where they've been, one could argue, post-World War II, and the United States more so post-1989. One of the big reasons for the sort of disruptive tech change is that it's extremely fast. It's going at a pace in which we don't really have the time to analyze it. And I think legislators or political decision makers don't have it either. I mean, if you go 5 years back, it was all about crisis management here in Europe. It was about the euro and about the asylum crisis, and there was very little focus on, how technology will change the way in which we work, what happens when we start bringing in elements of biology and technology, what will that do to mankind, and all of this, and I'll finish with this, my first answer, all of this is really at the end of the day about values. How do we react to a situation whereby we are already capable of DNA manipulation through CRISPR technology, whereby we are already at this stage becoming some kind of, if not hybrids, cyborgs between machines and human beings, and where the limits of that are. So that's why I'm saying that this becomes a battle of values between, I would say, China and the United States as the sort of focal power points, and then the European Union as one of the players as well.
Now, this point you make about values, I think, is really interesting and important. I mean, I know that technology has accelerated in terms of the pace of innovation, and that challenges values, but how are we supposed to bring values into the regulatory process, right? I mean, because one of the things that I was struck by in reading through the proposal was the extent to which the political process, the links between people and politicians, which is the conveyor belt that's supposed to bring popular values into politics and regulation, that seems to be changing as well. So how are the regulators supposed to figure out what they're supposed to do, both technically and in terms of social values, in this fast-paced changing context?
Well, that's a big question. And if you really want to simplify the argument, one could say that, it's a question of, are we in the process of creating digital democracies or digital dictatorships? And that was one of the original working titles of the book as well. Because if you remember, I mean, probably you and I, say in the early 2000s, were quite excited about the perspectives of technology impacting influence and citizen action and democracy. And many of us actually believe that, listen, we have these new social media, Facebook, Twitter, later on Instagram and others. And so the onslaught of freedom and open and public transparent discourse is basically going to disrupt and destroy many of the more traditional authoritarian regimes, ranging from Russia to China and beyond. And a lot of people believe that as well. say around 2010 with the Arab Spring, when people were called on to different fora to take action. But then soon it became quite apparent that, well, as a matter of fact, you could start using technology and data completely in the opposite direction. So if you want to make it into a literary battle, I guess you could argue that it's a bit, George Orwell, Big Brother in 1984, fighting against Aldous Huxley, A Brave New World, and the impact of technology for us human beings. And we're still sort of grappling with that. The final point on this, I actually argue, without being overly dramatic in this, I would probably argue that there is an element of a threat to democracy, and the reason is very simple. Democracy, if you look at Kahneman's book on Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast, he had a really good observation about what we call System 1 and System 2 brain. So System 1 is pretty much our sort of quick, emotional way of reacting to different types of situations. It's very intuitive. The way in which you and I are perhaps discussing here, and the way in which people are listening online, they create a very quick impression, what is this guy saying? Does this make sense or not? Then there's System 2, which is the rational and the slow and the contemplative part of your brain. Now, my argument is that from a perspective of democracy, democracies were originally created for System 2. I mean, this was, John Locke and Rousseau and the rest of them thinking that, well, democracy is slow, it's representative in different types of ways, you require compromise and dialogue before you reach the decision. Well, the problem is that the world is nowadays System 1. So democracy hasn't been able to adapt to modern means of communication, or it has done so, but perhaps in a rather questionable way. I mean, you can say that the United States is a democracy, and you can say that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has been democratically elected. Then you can, of course, question, is his behavior on Twitter or otherwise, traditional behavior of a democracy? I don't know. But the bottom line is that this whole technological thing is bringing to the fore the assumption that we thought, in a Fukuyama kind of a way, end of history, everyone will move towards, liberal democracy, social market economy and globalization. And here we're learning quite quickly that, perhaps this is not the case. So at the end of the day, it becomes your question, is this disruptive and or transforming, and if so, in what direction?
So it's funny, I had a whole pivot that I was going to do to international relations, but we're going to get back to that because you just made me think of something. Maybe the problem is that not that governments have adapted too slowly to technology, but that people have adapted too quickly. I mean, the civic culture, it assumes that you don't want politicians to respond to your every whim, but if you have the ability to communicate to politicians your every whim, and indeed everybody is encouraging you to do so, maybe that's the problem, that our politicians, our politics is getting overloaded with impulses from the people, and at the same time, the people are expecting politicians to respond in real time to concerns that take consideration and deliberation in order to address.
Yeah, in many ways, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, I'm talking about democracies now. I mean, democratic politicians, their lifeline is public life, and that public life, could have taken place in city-states or in markets in a plethora of different ways. Then the media came in between, printed and otherwise, which was able to communicate what the politicians were saying. Probably in the beginning was rather one-sided, and then at some stage it moved more and more into not news-like reporting, but more interpretation of the situation. And then that became sort of a feed-in to social media. So a lot of politicians, probably including myself to a certain extent, really enjoyed the possibility of being able to communicate something without a filter. It had its risks, because sometimes you press the send button on a blog in 2005 a little bit too early. And sometimes, you press the send button on a tweet a bit too early and got into trouble with it. But there was this element that, hey, I'm allowed to say whatever I want without anyone interpreting. And it was quite comfortable. Well, that then led to the fact that people reacted to it very quickly, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. And then, of course, this whole rigmarole about fake news and trolls and so on and so forth. So suddenly you get into a situation of social media which in essence is in many ways the epitome of free speech. You're able to express yourself, but as a politician, you become scared shitless because what basically happens is that whatever you say will be skewed in different types of directions. So the filter is not your traditional media anymore. It becomes everyone. And that's why the message can go in all kinds of different directions from what you originally meant. And we haven't been able to, I think contain is the wrong word, but we haven't been able to learn how to cope with this and sort of go into, how would I say, purposeful misinterpretation, which we see a lot in politics today. You read into something and then it just basically explodes because you start interpreting it in one direction. And this is what we're trying to come to terms with in democracies.
Now, it's interesting because as you were speaking, I reflected on this anecdote that you tell in the proposal about a conversation you had with Angela Merkel about what it means to be prime minister right now. I mean, are normal people able to sustain the kind of psychological pressure you must have been under from all the different reactions that you had to your every, common utterance?
Well, it depends a little bit who you are, but she did give me two wonderful pieces of advice, because I basically landed the prime minister job in a quite awkward position at the end of an electoral cycle with just 10 months to go to the elections, and with an opposition party leader who, how would I say, was ideologically a little bit on the other side of the fence to myself, and also was new, so had to show to his own that he would manage. In any case, so then one time I, sat next to her in the European Council, and I think I say it in my sort of biographical book in Finnish as well, and I asked her, what do you do when the shit hits the fan, when it's really uncomfortable? And her advice was twofold. One, go and campaign and be with your own, which basically meant that you get the positive energy, because quite often your own believe that you're being unjustifiably criticized by the media and others. So you get a lot of positive energy from there. And the second one was, don't read what's written about you in the media. So, take away all of your namesake alerts and other things. Now, I want to say that you grow used to it, the sort of, how to say, negativity and the criticism. And to a certain extent you do. But I was okay when it came from, how would I say, ideologically opposed quarters. So, if it was someone who was extreme right and was say anti-immigration, and I was pro-immigration, and I'll get some, slander on that, I thought, that was fine. I've always been pro-gay rights, and I pushed through gay marriage in Finland as a minister and later prime minister. So I got a lot of people who criticized me for that. I'm fine with that. Or, if I were to, push a pro-environment, the climate line, and I'd get slandered by someone who wasn't of that opinion. Or if and when I was pro-market, then I'd get attacked by the extreme left for being too pro-globalization or pro-EU. That was fine. But what I found most uncomfortable were people who I knew that were ideologically on the same line with me, say they were liberal internationalists, and they would start misinterpreting who you are just because of the party that you come from, and then sort of spreading false news. The media does its job. There's not much you can really do about that. As long as it's correct and fair, it's fine. But media is extremely powerful as well, and you have to understand that as a politician. And my line was never to criticize the media, because that's basically an endless pit. And at the end of the day, the media always has the last word. And you're not gonna win that battle. Final point on this: my big worry, however, is that sensible, intelligent, well-educated people are going to stay away from democratic politics in the future if we continue on this line. What I mean is that the upside of going into politics just simply is not worth it anymore, because you realize that, you know, you become a public figure. At times your security will be threatened, your integrity will be attacked, and a certain picture is painted of you. So I admire a lot of people who still go into politics. And, you know, if someone asks me, should I do it? I say, yeah, please go ahead. I mean, you know, we need sensible people. But I'm just worried that you know, this is going to stop, because your life is just turned upside down, and then, you know, your reputation is tarnished. One politician put it once quite well. She said that, Alex, you must remember that when you go into politics, you lose the copyright of your own motivations. That's quite rough, you know.
Now, you know, we've been talking about the impact of media on the relationship between the people and politicians, but what about the relationship between people and policy? I mean, you were also finance minister during the third Greek bailout, which was the real Greek crisis in the summer of 2015. Did you find that the way technology works actually made it harder for you to negotiate in the ECOFIN Council about what should happen with Greece?
Not really in that particular case. I mean, again, it comes down to, do you believe that you're right or wrong in what you're doing? I was a bit between a rock and a hard place, because at the time we were in government with the true Finns. So you can imagine that, you know, when you have three parties, the center party, then us, the center right, and then the true Finns in government, you had to find compromises. And one of the sort of lifelines of the party at the time, and I guess still is, was to a certain extent to be anti-European. So I had, as finance minister, to reflect basically a compromise line that had been put together inside the government. And then, which basically meant that I, in essence, had to take a slightly more tougher line that I would have personally probably taken at that particular situation. That means that you get stamped, you know, you become whatever, Mr. Austerity or something like that, and then you live with that stigma for the rest of your life. But at that time, you have to also understand that, you know, when you're finance minister of a country, and when you know, fiscal policy and when economic policy is basically still generated by the nation state, you are at the end of the day responsible to your voters and your taxpayers. And if the argument goes that there was a set of rules that had to be followed, and because the rules were not followed, you know, Finnish taxpayers' money would have to be used. I give this just as an example because that was the type of perhaps slightly simplified, but to a certain extent justified argumentation that was used. Finally, and as a little bit of an anecdote, I should tell you that I'm now working here very closely with a dear friend and a colleague, George Papakonstantinou, who was the finance minister of Greece during the PASOK, so the left government, right when the crisis had started. So, of course, we share notes about how we felt in the situation. I mean, I was sort of doing his job 4 years later, so our paths didn't cross as such. But of course, you know, we can compare notes, both personal about what it felt like to be a politician when, you know, your security is threatened. I mean, I got coke thrown on me back in Finland. Our house was attacked at home, and these kinds of things. And so, you know, again, you look at the cost, and we both come to the conclusion that probably freedom is a nicer thing from a personal perspective than responsibility.
But that's a perfect setup for opening this up to compare these different institutional contexts, right? Do you think that the situation that you faced is any better or worse from the situation that politicians face in the United States? Or is it any better or worse from what politicians face in a country like China?
Well, listen, politics in many ways, whether democratic or authoritarian, in a simple division between the two, is always at the end of the day about crisis management and providing security and welfare for whoever you represent in whichever form of government. So probably a Chinese authoritarian and centralized system will be sustainable as long as there is economic growth, there is a feeling of prosperity, of basically opportunity and possibility, and a rather strong feeling of sort of a national sense, if you will. In the Chinese case, would I feel comfortable to be a leader in China? Probably not. I quite like the perspective that my career will end with a sword of a vote rather than another type of a sword. I like to live in political systems where your perspective after politics is to stay alive, not end up in a coffin, or in sort of leaving the country, if you will. I'm not saying that happens in China, but there are elements that make me feel a little bit uncomfortable of an authoritarian state. In democracies, it's of course quite different because at the end of the day, you get voted out justifiably or not. And what you have to do in that particular situation is not to bear a grudge. I've seen a lot of politicians who feel that they've been unjustly treated, and that they sort of hold that grudge for the rest of their lives. I mean, yeah, there are elements that you can't like about the way in which you get kicked out, but at least in a democratic system, usually it's been quite fair.
Now, in that context, I guess I have to, as an American, we have this big debate that's going on right now about the way technology is being used basically to mob people who can be accused of inappropriate behavior or inappropriate ideas and push them out of the conversation. And within the Republican Party, certainly the ability of the president to rile up the base against people who defy his authority is also been noteworthy of late. So do you think that there's a kind of a dark side to this in the way it influences democratic politics?
Yeah, definitely. But before I answer that, let me just say one thing, because I didn't properly answer your previous question. If I had a choice to be prime minister in the middle of a financial crisis, asylum crisis, or COVID-19, I would choose COVID-19 hands down. And the reason is very simple. It is a threat to a certain extent to security and health, and everyone is on your side. So you have to really screw up as a leader in terms of getting the crisis management wrong to become unpopular after that. So I think as a crisis, it's horrible to say, but it's as good as it gets. Now, is there a dark side to technology? I would argue yes. And I'll be very frank with you. I think a lot of people underestimated the capacity of President Donald Trump to use that technology in the elections of 2016, and of course now during his 4 years in office. And he's an extremely shrewd operator. I mean, quite often you get a feeling that he's just sort of shooting off the cuff or the hip. But the truth is that there seems to be a capacity to move the ship in all kinds of directions at the same time. And then we get to the question of the use of data. Are we using data for good, or are we using data for bad? And who is using it and in which way? I'm not qualified enough to say, I read the same reports, probably the same newspapers that you do, except you read the Italian ones and I can't do that yet. But other than that, we get a feeling of who's been meddling in elections. Is it Russia? Are they trying to do what? Who is using data, meta or otherwise, to try to impact and influence elections? But it's all about influence. Then just the question is how you use that and how gullible we are in giving out that data for usage. So I do think, and I talk here as a European, I'll be very frank with you. I think, data, if it's the new gold, if it's the new oil, whatever we want to call it, we do need to get serious about how we can regulate the use of data. And, I have a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old. And sometimes we discuss the way in which they use data and what kind of an impact it has. And we have to understand that it's a commodity just like anything else, so therefore it should be regulated. And data, of course, is a hell of a lot more serious than, you know, I don't know, a banana, because, you know, data it's about your privacy, it's about your freedom, it's about news, it's about moving things. So it's, you know, it's something that we really, really need to look at. And I'm very much, you know, into the whole notion of trustworthy AI, for instance, and that's something that we need to look at together. I'll finish off with this by saying, you know, it is not irrelevant who is doing the algorithms. Is it the good guys or is it the bad guys? And we have to have an international framework or set of rules to deal with this, whether it's in the US, UN, Europe, or elsewhere.
No, it's funny, as I listen to you say that, it reminds me that, you know, when I started studying European integration, presumably when you started studying European integration, our focus was all on voluntary industrial standards. And so if we were having a conversation about technology back then, we would be having the technology about whether the standard is open or closed, in Microsoft or Apple. Now it seems to be much more about regulatory standards. And that's quite a big shift. Do you think that the different kinds of government that you look at, the United States, Europe, and China, are differently effective in terms of promoting these kinds of big regulatory standards?
Yeah, definitely. Let me give you two answers on that. The first one is to say that I think the state is back in the game. You remember when we started back in X, Y, and Z, and I started studying, you know, at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, in 1989. Then it was all about market. It was about the four freedoms. Communism collapsed. East met West in Europe. It was about reconstruction, reconciliation, and liberalization. You know, go into capitalism the hard way. Free movement of goods, services, people, and money. Deregulate, get out of your communist scheme. We don't need this bureaucracy. We don't need this regulation. Then the state started coming back, I would argue, the first time around, around 9/11, when security came into the game and the fight against terrorism and the incitement of fear, which was in many ways used by governments as a pretext to regulate and have tougher, you know, sanctions, have tougher rules. Then came 2008 and Lehman Brothers. What happens? Boom, state comes in again and says, listen, the financial sector was too deregulated. You know, you have Greenspan and others saying, shoot, you know, I was wrong. And who comes in and does the master regulation? Well, the European Union. Why is that? Because if the European Union is one thing, it's a regulatory superpower. It really knows how to regulate. It is the biggest market in the world, believe it or not. It is also probably the most unified regulatory market in the world. And then comes the asylum crisis, which also brought state back to a certain extent, borders, and this whole notion of freedom is put on the back burner. And the icing on the cake, of course, is COVID-19 and the Corona crisis and the lockdowns. And here we've seen the comeback of the state. And then we come to a situation, okay, you know, where are the limits of freedom? Do we put freedom ahead of security? You know, should I go on a COVID app, which basically detects my every move wherever I am, at the same time gives me information? Have I been close to a person who's been infected? You know, how far do I allow the state to be watching over my shoulder? So the state is in many ways back, and now we need to come to a situation where, okay, how do we regulate this thing without it encroaching on our privacy too much? And here there are two philosophies, and I know I'm simplifying a little bit, but I think in China, I'm not saying that they trust the state more, but there is an element of okay, let the big system take care of it. It's okay to do your WeChat. It's okay to have a social app which basically determines who you are and what you do and whether you get mortgage or health insurance and the rest of it. But is that what we want in the West? Is that what we want in Europe? Is that what we want in the United States? And my answer to that would be probably not. We don't. So we do need some kind of regulation on this before it goes out of hand. I don't mean to sound alarmist here. I come back to your disruptive versus transforming. If this is both disruptive and transforming, just like in any kind of systems, economic systems or political system, it will need some form of regulation at the end of the day.
Now, in that context, I guess we should also bring in the notion of power between states and not just power within states, right? I mean, there's this big debate about 5G, for example, and the belief that the Chinese government is using that particular technological standard in order to carry out intelligence operations. But there's also the extent to which the United States monitors all this internet traffic and gleans an enormous amount of information about what people are doing. And the Europeans themselves have begun to use their regulatory influence in order to exercise power. So do you think that the world is being reshaped in this sense, that power is being transformed and disrupted as much as everything else?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a bit tectonic, but I sort of a little bit provocatively, when we titled this, it was a new world disorder, but should really put the word or the letters dis in parentheses, because we could really, as international relation theorists or political scientists or European integration specialists, ask the question, is this really a disorder, or is it just a change of power and a shift in power which we cannot understand yet? We are all retrospective in our analysis. I keep on saying this, and I hope that George Papakonstantinou is not online because he'll laugh at me again. I think we as human beings have a tendency to over-rationalize the past, over-dramatize the present, and underestimate the future. So we go back in history and think that something happened for the reasons of X, Y, and Z, when really it is only an interpretation of historians, academics, journalists, politicians of the sun. It's not value neutral. It's easy for me to say that, yes, there are 3 big dates that have changed the West in the past 100 years. 1945, World War II, the creation of a bipolar world, and multilateralism. And Soviet Union versus the United States. Well, was this self-evident in 1945? No, it wasn't. It's something that grew in the narrative of history. It's easy for me to say that date number 2 is 1989. When I started at Furman University and the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, did I know that this was the big shift? No, but it's been interpreted with hindsight to be that. And then 2008, was that the big date when capitalism changed and the financial markets changed? Well, to a certain extent, yes. But this is all with hindsight. And what we do at the same time is to dramatize. So we're saying, oh my God, Donald Trump got elected. Yeah, he did. Or, my God, Putin, Erdogan, they're macho leaders. Ooh, what is Boris Johnson doing? This is, I think, the narrative of history. It's always a little bit chaotic. It just feels more chaotic because the information flow is so much faster at the moment. China was the predominant power, say, in the 1400s. Then just because the last century was an Anglo-Saxon or American or European century doesn't mean that it's like that forever. In the beginning of 2000, Fareed Zakaria talked about the post-American world. Well, we're not there yet. And then suddenly, a Citigroup economist talks about the BRICS, and everyone just talks about, whoa, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Korea, or South Africa. And, these are just simple solutions to extremely complex problems. So the world is not as disorderly as we believe. That was the first part of my answer. Now I forgot the second one, but you have to pose the question again.
No, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, because you you reminded me that you were the prime minister of what is a relatively smaller country in the world. And there was a time when small was beautiful. Peter Katzenstein was writing about small states and world markets. Alberto Alesina, the late Alberto Alesina, was writing about the size of nations. And the presumption was that these small states could actually go off and be the perfect place, like Denmark, getting Denmark with Mantra and the World Bank. As I listen to you talk, though, I wonder if that's still possible, or whether these small states need to find close cooperation regimes if they're going to survive in this new order that you're describing.
Yeah, so there's a misunderstanding that Finland is a small state, you see. I mean, we just celebrated our centenary of independence in 2017, but actually people didn't understand at that time we gave Russia its independence. But, you know, bygones are bygones. No, I think, you know, it is probably easier to deal with a smaller entity, and probably easier to deal with a smaller entity which is linguistically quite unique, geographically rather isolated, and in general rather homogeneous. And especially with an entity like Finland, which grew, I would argue, from rags to riches from the 1970s onwards. And when the world opened up in 1989, we took that opportunity, joined the European Union, we got on the Nokia boom, and the rest is history. And then suddenly, you know, we are one of the, per capita, not the richest, but, you know, up there. And if you look at all the different types of indexes, whether it's happiness or climate or freedom of speech or rule of law, you know, we're up there on top. It's not a difficult position to be, but a small state usually has to find a balance, and especially a balance between powers. And then it's a question of how do you deal with it? Well, Finland, I could say with hindsight, was on the borderline in the 1960s and 70s, when we had a president who was very close to the Soviet Union and was looking for that balance. We wanted to make sure by joining FinEFTA and other Western institutions that everyone sees us as a Western player, and that the Soviet Union could not start using us. At the same time, we had to do political and economic decisions, which with hindsight for someone like me feel rather uncomfortable at the moment. But would have I done things differently? Well, when you have 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia, which is an aggressive power at worst, you know, you kind of have to take your choices. Now, the second answer to this is that, you know, I do sometimes question the whole notion of a nation state. And I know I've probably slaughtered for this, but, you know, the nation state is a fairly new, you know, conglomeration or concoction, right? You know, the peace in Westphalia, the emergence of nation states and a nation state identity. And I wonder at what stage we move beyond this notion, especially because, you know, globalization is part of the DNA of what the world has been ever since, you know, Homo sapiens started to evolve. And the question is, you know, will there be a different type of an entity? Are we at one stage going to move, for instance, to a European identity? Well, if you look at the debate in Europe right now, probably someone would say no. At the same time, when Brexit happens, you get the biggest European movement in the history of the European Union in the United Kingdom. So it goes in all kinds of different directions. So I do think, and I'll stop here, but I do think Fukuyama and others are right when they're saying that we're to a certain extent seeing an end of ideology and a re-emergence of identity. What that identity will then be, is it nation state based, or is it, you know, I'm here, you are here in Northern Italy, is it going to be Northern Italy based, or, you know, what is the identity at the end of the day? I really don't know.
Well, Alexander, I've been quietly cannibalizing the questions that the people in Zoom land have been putting on the Q&A chat. I'm going to hit you with one last element from one of their questions, and then I'm going to try to bring some questions in from the audience here, if I may. And the last element of the question draws on what you just said, and that is, you know, when we think about identity, could we imagine, instead of going up to Europe and so leaving the nation state and becoming European or something like that, could we imagine either regressing down or going all the way up? Could we imagine a human-based world order as opposed to a nation-based world order, and talking about international relations assumes the nation state. But could we imagine a world order that's not based on that, but based on something that's much more universal?
Sort of a global government of sorts. I guess in my idealistic world, I would have to answer you yes. I mean, I think that at the end of the day is the mega trend that we might see. Whether we end up there and how we end up there is a completely different story. I mean, you know, what will the United Nations be, say, in 100 years from now? Will it still exist? We'll remember it started, you know, in its United Nations 2.0 format with 50 member states, then later I think 51, and now 193. Is it the type of an institution which can create long-lasting order into this world, which is completely human-based? I mean, it certainly tries to do that, but it's not going to happen without, you know, radical reform. And one of the problems, I guess, is that, you know, if the world is completely flat, if you know, globalization takes over and technology takes over, what will the format of governance at the end of the day be? Of course, the biggest impediment to that is I'll be very frank with you, egotistical, in many ways megalomaniac politicians, because, you know, quite often they don't want to give up power. But the interesting thing is that you could ask yourself the question now is, are, for instance, democratic politicians as powerful as they used to be? Do they have as much control of democratic governance and legislation as they used to have? My answer to that is no, because they're basically being pressured from many different directions. From above, by supranational legislation, such as the European Union, where EU legislation, when it has legislated, is above national law. And on the other hand, from the regional level, where regional identities are becoming more and more prevalent, and most importantly, through the direct contact from human beings. I think we'll probably see a phase of regional integration first before we go into human-based governance. So you start seeing bigger entities, and sorry for being a bit, you know, Leon Lindbergh is neo-functional and the rest of it or Ernst Haasish in this, but, you know, the African Union. Are we going to see something similar in South America? You know, is it going to be Mercosur or Mercosur Plus? What's going to happen in the US? How about ASEAN and Asia and so on and so forth? It'll take time, but just like with the future of work, we simply don't know.
Okay, I do have some more questions for you, but I'm conscious of the fact that we have a large audience out here, and I want to try to draw them into the conversation. The two things that I should say are, first, if you want to ask a question, put your hand up, because we need to bring you a microphone so that you can be heard by our participants in the Zoom land, including our speaker himself. And second, when you ask your question, please identify yourself and tell us a bit about where you're from. So, yes, sir. We'll start with the gentleman in the middle, and then Zoe right behind him.
Yes, so my name is Julien. I'm French and German, and I'm a Maya student. And I remember in like 2009 or 2010, when everybody joined Facebook, suddenly it became like the perfect place to socialize. And that's why it's also called a social network, I guess. But that idea started to change in 2016 after the elections, when we increasingly realized that these places could be echo chambers. And that's not only a weakness that is harnessed by political powers to polarize, but it's seemingly also a process that happens like endogenously to these digital spaces. And so therefore, my question would be, how do we overcome this social and digital divide that is running through our societies today?
I think it's a very good question and an extremely good introduction. I guess the first observation to make is that I think Facebook, probably as the pioneer of inclusive, if you will, social media, was the space where we started the conversations in various kinds of ways. See, I'm so old that I think I was the first politician in Finland to have an open blog when I got into politics in 2004, and people were, oh, how do you do that? You're going to get people to comment on what you do. I sort of laugh at it, 14 years later. Yeah, I guess that was the point. Facebook was a nice way of doing it. And if I can give you a little Netflix recommendation, if you haven't watched it already, go and check out Social Dilemma. It just came out, and it's basically about tech giant entrepreneurs who had worked for, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and others. They tell their story of what they were trying to do. So for instance, there you have a guy who is the father of the thumbs up or like. And he says that, well, originally the idea was just to have increased positivity, that woohoo, that was a cool statement that you just make. I like your comment. But of course now with the use of data and data mining and otherwise, that it's used to create a certain profile of who you are, and that algorithm then skews you in different types of directions. So something that was supposed to be social and in many ways increase tolerance in conversation has done exactly the opposite. Because what do? Well, we like people and follow people who think like us. It's quite natural. I mean, your best friends are probably not going to be people who you fight with all the time or whose experience is very dissimilar to yours. It could be, but most of the time they're not. So what it has done at the end of the day, it's making the world more black and white. And not only that, we have algorithms and the type of use of data that does it. What do we need to do? I think Nick Clegg was on the front page of the Financial Times yesterday or today, talking about how they will react to the polarization in the in the U.S. elections and the debate. I guess it's good that you try to force the big tech giants to do this. And the interesting change has, of course, been that these tech giants used to be like, they were the godsend who freed us and helped us. And now they're in many ways the bad guys. If I can give you a little bit of a commercial break, we just landed a wonderful project called EDMO, EDMO, at the School of Transnational Governance here at the European University Institute. Basically, it's a commission grant to then forward grants to how to cope with fake news. So that's a good start. First of all, regulate, think about what the regulations should look like. And then after that, start creating the tools with which you can chase, if not the truth, at least try to fight against fake news, which will then avoid polarization.
Excellent. Zoe?
Well, hi, I'm Zoe. First of all, thank you for your interview talk. I'm a student from the Netherlands, concentrating in international political economy. And well, we talked a bit about the difficulties that governments are facing in trying to regulate technologies and especially keeping up with the technological developments. And then you talked, or you mentioned, trustworthy AI at some point. So it made me think of Stuart Russell, leading scientist in the field of AI, who says, or he believes, first of all, that AI is not only a threat to democracy, but even humankind. But that aside, he, like you, thinks ethical AI, trustworthy AI, all very good, but not enough. So in his research, he's proposing that these AI systems need uncertainty built into themselves, so that for very difficult questions, they should go to human. In other words, this is a proposal of kind of self-regulating of the field. So scientists ways of how to deal with certain challenges that arise with technologies. So my question would be, what is your view on self-regulation with these extreme difficult technologies that, I mean, if you compare it to the financial crisis that arise from very technical products, these are even more difficult systems for people to understand. So how should we see this kind of self-regulating in these kind of extremely advanced technologies?
It's a really tough nut to crack. You know, I want to give you a very simple answer. We need both, but at the same time, you know, having studied artificial intelligence and robotization and digital revolution, probably for the past 4 to 5 years, fairly seriously, I've just come to the conclusion that the force is so mighty that I'm not 100% sure that self-regulation is enough. If that then helps the other type of regulation, I think that's great. What I'm really looking for is, first of all, an understanding of the benefits and the risks of artificial intelligence. And there, I think you're right in the sense that our human brains are not necessarily capable of seeing all the benefits and all the risks as such. We can just sort of scrape the surface. Secondly, I'm looking for a human-centric approach, and this might sound a little sort of blah blah. You know, come on, Alex. You know, what do you mean by a human-centric approach? But I think for me that means basically trustworthy AI, and that has to be based on 2 basic elements that I've been talking about, and I'm probably plagiarizing this from somewhere else. But it's a respect of fundamental rights, a respect of regulation, a respect of values, and basically AI with an ethical purpose. Then you come to the question, okay, who defines what's an ethical purpose? Well, in many ways, I think we have the foundation in the Convention on Human Rights. We just celebrated, I think, the 75th anniversary. And I understand that it's difficult, but there are some of the key elements. Secondly, we need a technologically robust and reliable system of AI. So we need to have these sort of technological guards. If that then means, for instance, that you have some self-regulation, that when the question becomes too complex, or you reach a certain limit, it has to go back to the humans, I think so be it. But I think there is an element of competition here as well, and I think the Commission in one of their reports put it quite well. They wanted to brand it, and I'll just throw, Zoe, this at you and say, okay, trustworthy AI made in Europe. Not bad, huh? Because it's a brand like a product. So, would you say trustworthy AI made in China? You decide. Or then you get, Donald Trump tweeting, capital letters, trustworthy AI made, well, by me, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Of course, that means that, it has to then be technologically sound. Of course, I'm an eternal optimist, and I belong to the category of people who says that, listen, at the end of the day, through trial and error, we will solve this. We will be able to rein in technology. And I don't believe the doomsdayers. I think Max Tegmark talks very well about this in his Life 3.0 book. If you look at the intro there or the forward, he says it, okay, you have 3 categories of people that deal with this. You have the tech pessimists who say, oh my God, it's already too late. The algorithms are going to take over. And, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator is just around the corner. We as human beings, we're dead meat. Secondly, you have the tech optimists who say that, oh, no problem. We'll just let it go rampant. We don't need any regulation. Self-regulation is fine. And then you have what I would call the gang, or he calls the gang, I think, benign AI. So people who understand both the opportunities and the threats. And this is the balance that we need to have. But I do believe that this is, it's as international as it gets. And it's the key question for the coming decades for all people around the world.
Super. I have a gentleman in the blue shirt that I've recognized. Alexander, would it be okay if I collected a couple of questions?
You could. This is a sign that I'm not being a Finn and giving my answers way too long.
No.
Hello, my name's Noah Fywell. I come from the United States, and I'm a first-year MA student. As an American, a lot of times in media, we see firsthand the destabilizing effects that a lot of particularly social media technology can have. I speak to the last 4 years as one pointer to that. Whereas our media representation of a lot of other states portrays it as a tool that has strengthened their regimes. In this case, I point to coverage of a lot of China, I point to coverage of Russia, where they're either using these social technologies as not only to reinforce the stability of their regime, but also as a tool to influence the politics of other nations. Whereas we don't really see that in our portrayal of events, and I'm sure it happens, but that's not the narrative we get. So I'm curious about your perspective, particularly as the former prime minister, how you see the effects of these social technologies upon more authoritarian countries, as well as liberal democracies, whether it is purely an instrument that is aiding the stability of their order, or whether there are in fact forces that we don't easily see on the ground level that are making things complicated for them as well.
Actually, you know what, Alexander, I'm going to let you take that one because that's a question that runs right up the alley of your book.
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, it was a very nice way of putting it, Noah. Thanks. I think it boils down to the question of, digital democracy or digital dictatorship. From a Finnish perspective, which I guess is a digital democracy, we've always been very sort of rules-based and adamant about not misusing data or information. And there are very strong movements on privacy and other elements. So in my capacity as Prime Minister, I obviously receive data and information and intelligence weekly, if not daily, which is, sensitive, but quite often from a military perspective rather than anything else. Would I have access to use the teledata of anyone, opponent or friend? The answer is absolutely not. Had I done that, I'd probably be jailed. So, there's sort of self-regulation in that sense. Did then social media at the end of the day destabilize Finnish democracy? Well, it certainly made it a bit more jumpy, I would argue. So if you look at, for instance, just the measurement, Finnish prime ministers post Cold War, so post 1989, it was fairly stable. So, the first one was there for 4 years, the next one was there for 8 years. But after that, 2003, there was a lady, Anneli Jäätteenmäki, for, I think, 3 months. Then there was stability with Matti Vanhanen for, I think, 7 years. Then there was a prime minister for 1 year, Mari Kiviniemi. Then there was my predecessor for 3 years. Then I was there for 1 year. The next one was 4 years. The next one was there for, 8 months. And now we have the 8th prime minister since 2003. Is it because of social media? Not only, but put it this way, the pressures of media and of democratic governance have become much harsher. And the trigger for being kicked out of office is much easier. Now, China and Russia, how is this going to play? Well, 2 observations. First of all, sorry for being very blunt, but let's forget the whole notion that Russia or China, especially China, will become a traditional Western democracy. It ain't gonna happen. It's not in the DNA of the system. And I say this with certain confidence. A country which hasn't embraced democracy and has been able to grow exponentially since it started to open up economically in 1979, we can forget this whole idea. The Communist Party is going to stick to its reins, come hell or high water. Russia, I made a bet, a bottle of champagne, I think in 2008, that Russia would start moving towards democracy, and I've lost that bet. You know, so I think these technological tools actually play into the hands of some of the dictatorships, at least in the short run. Then the question is, you know, are we going to see more Belarus type of movements coming around, which are incited by fear and movement, and there is an element of technological development in it? I don't know. So in the heart of my hearts, I want to believe that we move more towards this human-centric governance system because of technology. But, you know, if we're willing to give our whole lives already to a mobile phone, what happens when we link that mobile phone to a neural lace in our brain, and that can be controlled from a data point somewhere? Comeback from there is going to be a little bit complicated. So I want to believe that dictatorships fall because of technology, but right now I have very little evidence to back that up.
Well, that neural lace brain thing really freaked me out. So I'm going to bring Liv in to help change this subject.
Hi, my name is Liv. I'm originally from Germany, and I have two questions, and I hope that they are short, at least. One is, why do you think that smaller sized countries like Estonia are very much on the forefront for digital governance, while bigger countries, especially inside the EU, are much more behind? Like Germany is one of the least digitalized countries, while Romania and Estonia have better internet, better, well, Estonia has a online voting system and online taxation system that works very well. Why do you think bigger countries are reluctant to try it out? And my other question was, so in 2017, I met two members of the Finnish party, the Finnish parliament, Ozan Yanar and Simon Elo. And it was really interesting because they were the complete opponents for years, but they were extremely respectful with each other, unlike any other politicians I've ever seen before. Why do you think, what makes Finnish politicians so special that they can be so nice to each other at all times?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question. And you're asking a former prime minister and a former finance minister who was in deep shit in 2014 to 2016 about respectfulness of Finnish politics. I sort of I smirk a little bit. It certainly didn't feel like it. You do end up getting called names. One observation is actually, I think, a very important one. You know, we human beings are the kind that when we're close to someone and we can relate to that human being, quite often we are respectful, which means that we behave in a certain kind of a way. We don't want to hurt. But when there is distance, when we don't know that person, and especially in a space of social media, it's almost as if, you know, it's a free-for-all. And you know, I don't know how you feel, but sometimes on social media, you feel like, bloody hell, you know, I'm going to tell this person to blah, blah, blah. Whereas in person, you don't do that. So when I talk about social media behavior, say to my kids, I say, listen, think about it as your living room. I'm here now in my Airbnb flat in Florence. This is my living room. So I always think, okay, that person that I want to address is in the living room. We're in the same space, and that changes your behavior. I should add that both Yanar and Elo, they are actually quite respectful chaps. You know, Yanar is of a Turkish background, and if I recall correctly, he's from the Green Party. And he was very good in the movements against racism, whereas Simon Elo actually came from the moderate part of the True Finns party and is quite an intellectual, and then actually subsequently changed parties, and now he's in the moderates. He moved to my party. So these two guys, I can imagine them having a good conversation. But, you know, I look at social media stuff. I don't comment Finnish politics at all. When I left politics, I said, that's it. I don't want to be an, you know, ex-politician who is commenting. But I look at some of the language there right now, and I'm going, oh, I'm glad I'm not in there anymore. Your second question was more general about why are smaller states more competent in tech stuff. Well, I mean, I guess you could make a counter argument, say, well, look at China and look at the United States. They're both big states, and they've done quite well. And of course, Kai-Fu Lee, I think, wrote a book called The AI Superpowers and only really dealt with China and the US because they have, the scale and the capacity to develop technology. I think in Europe, the problem is more inherent. And yes, with all due respect, ich liebe Deutschland, ich spreche Deutsch auch. But I must say that traveling on an Autobahn in Germany is a wonderful experience in terms of driving in a car, but it's a horrible experience in terms of trying to get 4G connection. And I do agree with that. Is it perhaps to do with the fact that you've had a very protected telecom sector, which hasn't developed, whereas a country like Estonia fully understands that for it to, stand out, it has to brand itself and do that. So therefore, it went for e-Estonia, it went for e-identity, e-social security, e-identity cards, e-citizenship, and the rest of it. First time I was in a vehicle without a driver was in Estonia. Skype, depending on how you count, was created in Estonia. One of the biggest taxi companies globally, Bolt, is Estonian. So they've been able to do it because they need the innovation to survive. And that's, I guess, the blessing of being a small country. You're forced to do this, whereas in Germany, the scale is such that the necessity isn't there.
So, Alexander, I've got one question from the Q&A, and then I'll bring Connor into the conversation in a little bit. But the question, I think, comes from one of your colleagues, Marius Gincha, and it's really about this notion of identity politics. And the question is, what role do institutions like the EU play in fostering identity politics? And he points to two examples. One is the Euromaidan crisis, and the other is the migration crisis. And identity politics in Germany, and the sense I get, because I can't read the tone of the question, is that maybe the European institutions are reinforcing the identity of the nation state rather than diluting it. Connor, I'll bring you in as soon as we get an answer to this.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, you could say that, but is it the fault of? And please tell me if my sound gets worse now because I need to charge one of my iPods here. Great American invention. One of the dilemmas or catch-22s in all of this is very simple, and that is that it's very difficult to create a European identity as such, a pan-European identity. I mean, we feel very European perhaps when there's a Champions League final in football, but what is it? Well, it's usually two colloquial city teams that come from somewhere in Europe. We feel quirkily, funnily European when Eurovision Song Contest is on, but it's more tongue-in-cheek than really anything else. There is one moment when we feel European, and I know you might not think about this, but it's the Ryder Cup, when we beat the Americans in golf. That's when, even a Scotsman is waving the European flag rather than the Scottish flag. I'm not sure an Englishman would do that, but a Scotsman would do that. So the whole notion of creating a European identity is quite difficult. I mean, many of us who've lived in the Brussels bubble or studied at the College of Europe, or we can create a European. I would argue that Eric has a European identity, albeit he's American. He feels strongly about it. But the catch-22 comes from basically the way in which European stuff is reported. It's always rationalized, right? So we think about Europe, or at least the way in which it's communicated, through the brain. People will understand that free movement is good. And then we sort of congratulate. And, remember the Commission said in the beginning of 2000, we need to bring the European citizen closer to its people. And then you listen to some of the language that we hear from our European parliamentarians. Our citizens want. Well, it's all rubbish, really. Sorry for being so blunt, but it's not. You know, identity is local or national, and it's reinforced by the fact that, for instance, in European Council meetings, it ends in the middle of the night, and boom, all 27, previously 28, plus the President of the European Council, plus the President of the European Commission, sometimes the High Rep, go to their separate press conferences and give a separate narrative. And that narrative is always national. Look, I came here, I fought for national interest, and I won. So in that sense, it sort of, you know, and I used to do that as well, I guess, to a certain extent. I mean, lo and behold, I'd come out of budget negotiations and I had thought about all the lines to take from a Finnish perspective rather than a European perspective. And that's what reinforces the identity. Final point on that. But there's one exception. I think all of us felt a hell of a lot more European in 2016. First in the summer when Brexit happened, we started to think that, shit, is this what it could really lead to? And then popularity for the European Union went up. And then secondly, when Donald Trump was elected, it was, whoa, I'm glad I'm European at the moment. And this comes from a very strong transatlanticist. So it's a tough one, but European identity, you know, the Ode to Joy is a pretty cool piece of music, but, you know, it doesn't send shivers down my spine.
I should have, when I introduced Alexander, I should have mentioned that he went to the United States to go to college on a golf scholarship, which probably explains his disproportionate fascination with the Ryder Cup. Anyway,
and I want to add that I played in one tournament with Phil Mickelson and decided that he's going to play in the Ryder Cup and I ain't.
Hello, I'm Connor O'Brien. I'm a first-year MA student studying American foreign policy. You mentioned Kai-Fu Lee earlier, and in his book, AI Superpowers, he argues that China will eclipse the United States largely due to the sheer amount of data that the Chinese have access to when creating their AI. And my question is, how can Europe and also the United States kind of regulate the creation of AI and their uses if they are negotiating from a weaker position and playing catch up with the Chinese?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Kai-Fu Lee is right in the sense that if and when data is about scale and mass, you know, China has a competitive advantage, bar none. You know, it's got the population and it's got the capacity to do that data. You'll also remember that the sort of starting point for China getting extremely serious with AI was somewhere around, what, 2014, 2015, correct me if I'm wrong, when the champion in the game Go lost to the DeepMind algorithm in the game. And that's when they said, whoa, you know, if that can happen, then we need to start doing something about it. Yeah, there's an element of catch up here. Now, China has an interesting sort of quadruple competitive advantage. Well, don't get me wrong. Number one, it's authoritarian. So when China says it has a 5-year plan, it sees it through. In Europe, we have a 5-year plan, but sometimes, most of the time, it's tough to get it done because we're 27. Secondly, it does think globally, you know. I mean, the Silken Road, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative, creating infrastructure, it's playing an extremely smart game. Why is it doing that? Is it because it's Florence Nightingale and it believes that it's a wonderful thing to, you know, have world peace and eternal love? No, it's doing it because of self-interest. There's no question about that. Whether it's in Africa or whether it's in you know, Central Asia, Russia, or Europe. Thirdly, it has the consumers. It has the data, right? So, you know, it can mine as much data as it wants. And of course, it put an even new twist on it during COVID-19, when it went not only into teleworking immediately, but into face recognition and other things. And then finally, it's got the technology to do it. Now, where does the negotiating position of Europe and the US come in? I think it comes in market access. And here is an interesting game going on. I'm sorry for being a bit of a devil's advocate here. I think the US is going to put the brakes on China big time, no matter who is elected as president in November. The line is not going to change. The United States is united on one thing, and that is that enemy number one, economically or otherwise, technologically, is China. Now, what should Europe do in that? And here's where I become a shrewd geopolitician, and don't kill me for it. I think if that is the case, Europe should play ball, which means that stay true to your values and to your partnership with the United States. But do that 75% and play ball with China 25%. I think this will give, if this is a game, this will give a good negotiating position, I think, for a regional entity such as the European Union. And please don't think that I'm selling my soul, because at the end of the day, it's probably going to be a bit more complicated than that. But I do think that if Europe wants to be seriously geopolitical, it needs to do something in this field as well, because it doesn't have the same data scale that China does.
Okay, Michael Lee.
Yeah, good evening, Alex. Michael Lee. I teach here, and I used to work with your compatriot, Olli Rehn, on enlargement in the European Commission. What I'd like to ask you is this. Technology is certainly very important and is transforming international relations to some extent, as you've explained. But there are still leaders in the world who play by the old rules. And the principles of Machiavelli would not be foreign to the way they conduct themselves and their policy. Isn't there a sense in which the emphasis on technology and the EU as a kind of regulatory superpower is reinforcing the fact that we are disarmed when we're confronted with leaders who play by different rules? Just as we were with Milosevic in a previous period, now with Putin, arguably in the Eastern Med, with Erdogan, we simply don't know how to respond to leaders who are playing by the old rules and at the same time mobilizing technology to support them. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, sorry, it looks like my neighbor is shouting. I hope it's not coming through. Perhaps he heard the Erdogan kind of stuff. First of all, I'm glad you work with Olli. He's a good friend. We even co-authored a book together. He was the functionalist in the book, and I was the federalist, I think, sometime in 2007, 2008. Are there still some leaders that play with old rules? The answer is yes. I perhaps throw the question back to you and say, do these leaders have a serious impact? You know, you look at, for instance, COVID-19. I'll give that just as an example. How did these macho leaders do that played with old rules? You know, the Bolsonaros or the Trumps and the Erdogans and the Putins of this world. Did they do well? My answer is not. I think you can play with old rules to a certain point. And yeah, it's nasty and it's, you know, realist school and it's shrewd and the rest of it. And it can have a short-term impact. But I don't think in the long run it's possible. Yeah, there are plenty of examples. You take, for instance, Lukashenko and Belarus at the moment. He plays by the old rules, right? He's a macho leader. Is he going to last for a long time? I don't know. I think these sort of, you know, old school guys, they are a dying breed in many ways. It's just a question of when will they go away. But at the end of the day, of course, if you want to simplify things, it boils down to you know, what do you believe? What are your beliefs on human nature, good and bad? You know, are you a Hobbesian or do you come from another perspective? By the way, Machiavelli is not as bad as people think. There's also a good analysis of Machiavelli which shows that, you know, he has been misinterpreted a few times. And I'll be frank with you also, we here at the EUI at the School of Transnational Governance, we named a patron of the first master's student year, and I wanted to be the Machiavelli year, but I was vetoed. But but Machiavelli probably has a better reputation than what he is. So my argument here is that I actually think the EU will do quite well in this game. And let me come to the main point, which I would have probably said had I given a lecture, is that, if you look at I think this is going to be a century where the nexus of power is going to shift between the United States, the European Union, and China. And I do apologize to everyone else involved, but I am simplifying here. But I do think that one of the things that technology does empower people to see how green the grass is on the other side of the fence. And then it boils down to two very simple issues, which are, to a certain extent, your personal security, and the other one is your welfare. And this then becomes a question, who can provide this the best? Is it a regulatory superpower that regulates climate policy or data, or a welfare state which is able to have redistributive power in health and education and social affairs, and systems which are based on freedom and equality and universal human rights and the rest of it? Or is it more authoritarian regimes such as China or say, Russia or Turkey to a certain extent? I actually believe that it's the former, not the latter. And that's why I say, and I know that some of my friends just slaughter me for this, for being too idealistic. I do think that this could potentially be the century of the European Union, because the system simply works. I know we whine about it, but it works.
Well, Alexander, I have to say, I know that there are more questions in the room, and I'm sure that there'll always be more questions for a conversation this rich. But that was such an extraordinary way to end what's been a really insightful conversation. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to spend with us. Before you go, though, I do want to congratulate you on the launching of the School of Transnational Governance. That's really a tremendous feat. I wish you all the best of success. And thank you again for spending your evening with us.
Oh, thanks a lot, Eric. Yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And I'll put the commercial break. Applications are going to open soon for next year's master's students. So if you're thinking about a master's in transnational governance with a top team, come over and have a look at us. It's a really cool place, and we have a wonderful startup team spirit here. And not only that, we're soon moving down to a wonderful building down in the center of Florence called Buontalenti. But it was Eric, a pleasure to be here. And, we met a few times, and I, of course, read a lot of stuff that you've done over the years, and I really appreciate your insights and ways of expressing things.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you in the audience. This has been a terrific evening.
Thanks.